Last week we heard from Dr. Kishonna Gray, who spoke about her research into gaming communities and how they mobilize politically. And this week we're welcoming Dr. Chris Patterson and Dr. Tara Fickle. The way we're going to organize this is that I'm going to introduce Dr. Patterson first. He's going to give a short presentation, and then Dr. Fickle, who will then also follow with a short presentation. And then we're going to have a conversation, probably about half an hour. And the last third of our time together is going to be Q&A. So if you're interested in asking a question, you can drop it in the chat, or you can just put your name in or just write in the chat that you want to ask a question if you'd rather do it live. Or during that time period, you can raise your hand. You can use the function at the bottom of the screen there to raise your hand, and we can call on you. Right now, everyone's muted so that we won't have a lot of interruptions during the conversation, and we don't have to worry too much about Zoom bombing. But in that last third, you'll be able to unmute yourself. All right. So, Chris, are you ready? Shall I introduce you?
Yes.
Okay, so Dr. Patterson is currently an assistant professor in the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia, which is like the coolest title. He's a graduate of the UW English department, but he's traveled a long way to get back to the Pacific Northwest via China and Hong Kong, where he was awarded the Early Career Teaching Award from Hong Kong Baptist University. Dr. Patterson is the author of numerous articles and 4 books. His first book, Transitive Cultures, Anglophone Literature of the Trans-Pacific, won the American Studies Association Award for International Scholarship in Transnational American Studies. The book asks us to rethink the still powerful role of nation and how we interpret literature, and how drawing those national boundaries displace writing that exists between and across national boundaries. So you'll be able to see, I think, resonances across his work for some of these themes. His second academic book, the one that he'll be talking about today, is Open World Empire, Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games. It was published this year, and as I said, Dr. Patterson will be talking about that work today. But that's not all. Dr. Patterson is also a fiction writer and author of 2 literary works. His first book was Stamped, an anti-travel novel, which won the Association of Asian American Studies Creative Prose Award. And his second novel, just recently published, is All Flowers Bloom. Which one? Is this the one that's being revamped as a video game? Is it Stamped?
It's Stamped, yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully you'll all be able to see that soon. But I think it's fascinating that the idea of trying to translate some of your own work into video games. You can find those books under his pen name, Kawika Guillermo. And he's also the founder and co-host of the podcast New Books in Asian American Studies, which I urge you all to subscribe to. It's sort of a who's who of Asian American Studies scholars. So Chris, why don't you unmute yourself and you can get us started.
Okay, hello, hi everyone. Every time I hear that bio, I feel like I should go back to therapy because it sounds like the bio of a crazy person. I'm going to pull up my, there it is. My PPT, and so you can all see it. Hi, I'm Chris Patterson. Everyone can hear me, I assume. I'm coming to you live from UBC campus, which is on the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And I really want to thank LeiLani and University of Washington for hosting this event. We were supposed to come in April, I believe it was, and it was very disappointing, of course, that we couldn't. Meanwhile, everything else was falling apart in the world. But it's really fantastic that we can be here now virtually, even still. And I think as a father of a 3-year-old, it's also becoming more convenient because I don't actually have to leave my son. So thank you. Tara and I have both been in conversation for a very long time. And in fact, we read and gave each other feedback to our book chapters as they were in process. So it's really fantastic to be visiting University of Washington, where I got my PhD in English, but to be doing so also in conversation with a long-term collaborator and friend. So I wanted to use my time today to put my book more in conversation with the race card. And I'm going to do so by focusing on how my book, Open World Empire, toys with this term, the Asiatic, and a term I developed that means kind of what it sounds like, a way to describe the somewhat Asian, the Asianish, the Asia-like characters, environments, and forms commonly found in interactive media, which do not define Asia so much as reveal the gazes cast upon it. My goal today is to briefly reflect upon the allowances of interactive media and understanding our relationship with the Asiatic as a means of seeing race. So, my use of Asiatic differs from terms of endearment like yellow power or Asian American, as it references not the ways subjects see themselves, but the gaze that looks upon the other, so that Asiatic is more attributed than it is declared. At first, the term Asiatic seems too full of historical baggage to be made playful, which is precisely the risk of play. But Asiatic communicates how Asia and other racial forms blend in video games in ways that elude serious categorizations, quote unquote serious categorizations. So in her book, America's Asia, Colleen Lai conjures what she calls Asiatic racial form as a way to trace or unite model minority stereotypes of Asian Americans with yellow peril stereotypes of Asian immigrants in the early 20th century, showing how both racializations were based primarily upon economic anxieties. Asiatic becomes a way to visually encounter the unrepresentable foreign, pushing scholars to better account for the international context in which American race relations take shape. So not only is it doing that historical work, it's also doing a broader transnational work, which I hope Asiatic, the way I use it, is also doing. Asiatic, while Lai uses this term Asiatic racial form to wed racial discourses, Open World Empire attempts to understand the Asiatic within digital media as less representation or discourse and more as a stage that shapes the interactions in games as neither Asian nor Asian American, but as an unrepresentable blend. And I should say that's more specific to the audience in North America that's consuming it. Japanese characters in games are almost uniformly dubbed into an American accented English, forming Asian Americanness within entire genres of games. Japanese role-playing games, Japanese dating simulations, Japanese visual novels, for example. Similarly, the Asiatic shapes racialized characters like Final Fantasy VII's Barrett, who's you can kind of see up there on the left, who expresses a Japanese perception of American Blackness that is mediated through English translators, as well as through the player's own performance, all within a cyberpunk fantasy, which I see as a typically Asiatic form. In her book, Ornamentalism, Anne Chang uses the term yellow in naming the yellow woman, quote unquote, yellow woman, because it refuses the, quote, more ameliorative, politically acceptable terms like Asian American, and instead conjures, quote, the queasiness of this inescapably racialized and gendered figure. So like yellow, Asiatic offers political dilemma rather than safety, and its so-called baggage is exactly the remembrance that our technological breakthroughs have never helped us approach a post-racial world. Asiatic confronts and revises the serious baggage of racial naming, as it is a term often reserved for geographical space, animals or fauna, so Asiatic lilies, as you see here, Asiatic cougars, Asiatic barbarians, etc. Asiatic messes with the positivistic forms of race, widely recognized through the serious life world of scholarship and imperial optics, and as we see today, the kind of medical discourses, scientific discourses of COVID. The Asiatic also sees games as themselves as an Asiatic medium, so I guess that means I do that. Open World Empire, my book does that. I'm seeing the Asiatic as a cybertype in Lisa Nakamura's sense of a racial form, shifting, quote, into the realm of the virtual, a place not without its own laws and hierarchies. The estimated 2.2 billion gamers around the world are dominated by the Asia Pacific, which takes up 47% of revenue. Video games, I argue, are Asiatic even when they contain no explicit racial representations, as they are manufactured and innovated upon in Asian contexts and remain colored by Asian associations as new media products. Whereas David Rowe, Betsy Huang, and Greta New write in this book, On My Head, Techno-Orientalism, the Asian subject is perceived to be simultaneously producer as cheapened labor, designer as innovators, and fluent consumer as subjects that are one with the apparatus. I thus call games Asiatic not to reduce games into an East-West binary, where all Western players are Orientalist, but to account for the inescapability of Asian associations in games and to trace their trans-Pacific imperial contexts. Similar to yoga, tea drinking, and meditation, video games arrive as an Asiatic form, inviting players of all backgrounds to participate in and adapt into their own lives. And I should say that I get this term actually from digital networks and game cultures. I only realized later that Colleen Lai uses it, and I only remembered that she uses it in this way. So these Asiatic wallpapers and images were common search terms. Okay, next slide. Analyzing racial figures in games has proven particularly difficult due to a game's obscure nationalist ties as a transnational product and because gameplay has departed drastically from forms of the novel, cinema, and performance art. Except in rare cases, video games make little to no attempt to thematize race, even when including racialized main characters. The Prince and Prince of Persia, the Native American lead in Turok, the Asian American characters as we see here, Wei Shin, Ajay Ghale, Chell from Portal, and Faye. Most studies on race in video games, and this is when I would say this was 2 or 3 years dated at this point, but at the time, most studies on race in video games borrow analytical methods from other media, focusing on race only in games that are strikingly similar to cinema or in games that operate as virtual worlds like World of Warcraft or Second Life. And I think Kishona Gray also talked about that last time, that I think she called Grand Theft Auto, talking about race in Grand Theft Auto is low-hanging fruit, you know, in the terms of it's basically like talking about other cinema and so on. In the latter, in the types of MMOs like World of Warcraft, Second Life, race has been treated as a form of identity tourism, as Lisa Nakamura has defined it, as when, quote, the appropriation of racial identity becomes a form of recreation, evocation from fixed identities and locales. Going a step further, Dean Chan has written of playing racial others as a type of pixelated minstrelsy, while David Leonard has interpreted identity tourism as a form of high-tech blackface that licenses participants to, quote, try on the other, the taboo, the dangerous, the forbidden, and the otherwise unacceptable. Meanwhile, other scholars like Adrian Shaw have pointed out the habitual pathologizing of cross-identity play, which, quote, presumes a particular privileged identity as a starting point. So both Shaw and Anna Everett ask for more nuanced and context-driven analyses of race in games to push race from its relegated corner as either, on one hand, a structured absence where the game remains free of racial attitudes, or, on the other hand, a specious virtual presence where playing race remains a form of identity tourism, passing, or minstrelsy. As Shaw shows in her book, Gaming at the Edge, the presumption that marginalized gamers long to see people like themselves in games is often false, perpetuated by a market logic and imported from theories of film and literature. And I think Kishona Gray said similar things last week when she was talking about how Black gamers often become very apprehensive when they play a game that's supposed to represent them for understandable reasons. Still, the focus on representation in game cultures tends to replace more theoretically generative inquiries, like why do games that express racial stereotypes and encourage racial violence continue to be played by various audiences across the globe, including the audiences that they're supposedly mocking or parodying or being cruel to? Or simply, how are video games different than other media in expressing race? So to answer these questions in the book, I turned to games that have a kind of dizzying diversity, like Street Fighter II, Dead or Alive, League of Legends, and Overwatch. And this is mostly the first chapter of the book where I try to establish this framework. So these games feature a dizzying diversity of sometimes offensive and sometimes subversive racialized characters. Their depictions of race lead us to envision a larger theoretical basis for comprehending the experience of seeing race as a signal for a mode of play, as well as for a sense of racial playfulness. Nakamura called this sense of race a cosmetic multiculturalism, where, quote, local racial problems are shuffled aside by a global and diasporic diversity. However, to see race as cosmetic, to me, need not forego racial histories, but can also revise them through style, form, and surface rather than substance, which can be understood as a form of camp. So I pull throughout my book from a lot of queer theory. Camp, as Susan Sontag wrote, dethrones the serious to play within a decorative art that emphasizes texture, sensuous surface, and style at the expense of content. Characterized by the spirit of extravagance, camp is of artificial rather than authenticity, and thus, quote, sees everything in quotation marks. And this is similar to what other writers that I'm also going to talk about say about race and identity in games. The queer sensibility of camp provides a method to comprehend racial forms in games where one does not inhabit a racial other, but plays roles that carry the potential to dethrone the serious. So I developed the term Asiatic to account for how Asian forms in games are read as campy, blending, messy, and playful, and appear more within form rather than in direct representations. But to put the book into direct conversation with the race card, I want to examine how the Asiatic also sees race as a form of play, akin to how Wendy Chun also sees race as technology, where race is divided from biology, history, as well as culture, to represent other ways to do things, styles that cannot be known but can be done by emphasizing the similarities between race and technology. Tara Fickle, in her book, builds on the work of Chun and others to argue that Asian American cultures and politics have become attuned to using game-like attributes in political and aesthetic projects. She can feel free to correct me on anything. If culture acts as a sign of race in our analog world, then in a virtual realm, race dwells within play itself. So as a technological medium, video games can tell us much about what different technologies do to race. First, games compel us to see the virtual racial formations within play styles that are seen as foreign, minoritized, or intolerable. And so this is work that's, I think, Lisa Nakamura and others have done quite well, showing how styles too can be switched, toyed with, or made unexpectedly intimate and different means of inhabiting difference. A player, for example, might be seen as too Asian or too Chinese if they seem overly concerned with winning, even if it means evading most of the game's challenges and taking on a cheese, as in cheap and easy, style of play. And it doesn't matter what type of character this players are playing, their method, their way of playing could still be seen as Asian or Asiatic. Second, games allow us to examine how the pressure to share play attitudes obliges some players to fabricate a sense of happiness similar to those who thoroughly enjoy the game. As Sarah Ahmed has argued, the way one is supposed to play functions as a happiness script whose deviation risks spoiling the happiness of others. And some folks talk about this as the magic circle. And we see Tara also does a great reading of that. To play in ways that expose the post-race script of game culture is to be cast out as a threat to the existence of the play community. To be clear, seeing games as signaling a playful attitude towards race does not mean that representations of race are irrelevant within video games, quite the opposite. They just signify different types of meanings. So racial figures in games are rather infused with playful meanings. And as John Cheney-Lippold, I have this book right here, We Are Data, I just happen to have it on my desk. Digital representations of racial, gendered, and sexual difference often presume the presence of air quotes to denote not merely an uncertainty or inauthenticity, but to, quote, emphasize an ironic untruth. The digital representations of race in games operate through ironic untruths that rely upon the player's playful attitude toward the game. This attitude mirrors what I was talking about before with Sontag calling camp sensibility, an ability to perceive a double sense of campy and hyper-animated figures whose surface level frivolity signals not a representation of racialized people, but a quirky style of play. On the surface, they are pure artifice, figures that convert the serious into the frivolous, which strike the player as both offensive and alluring. In reducing meanings to the surface, to artifice to style, camp does not merely dismiss the serious, but involves a new, more complex relation to the serious. Our ability to read games as queer, campy, or racially playful is made possible by their ability to circulate across the Trans-Pacific as Asiatic commodities. And I'm using commodities here as commodity fetishism in that they obscure their relations of production, imperial relations as well. So seeing them as Asiatic commodities that are aloof from the serious world of our own national racial politics. So Asiatic communicates how Asian American and Asia blend in games in ways that elude serious categorizations. And Asiatic, for me, why I use it, I try to use it to see Asia as a construct needing to be problematized, as only existing within scare quotes or as holding an asterisk. What other terms might be called Pokemon catchers, cosplayers, or indeed the gaming world in general, if not Asiatic. And here's some receipts. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing now.
All right, thank you for getting us started, Chris. Sorry, Dr. Patterson. So let me give a quick introduction to Tara Fickle. Dr. Fickle is an associate professor of English at the University of Oregon and affiliate faculty of the Department of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies, the New Media and Culture Certificate, the Center for the Study of Women in Society, the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, and the Comics and Cartoon Studies and Digital Humanities minors. So this list should give you some sense of why she's been able to draw from such a wide array of sources, both popular and academic, in her work. Dr. Fickle received her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, and her BA from Wesleyan University. The Race Card, From Gaming Technologies to Model Minorities, NYU Press, both of the books that we're talking about today are from NYU Press, is her first book and the winner of the Before Columbus Foundation's American Book Award. She'll be talking about the research in the book today, and I don't want to step on the presentation too much by talking too much about the book here, but I can't recommend it more highly. Instead of seeing games as a distraction or escape from politics, or conversely as a reflection of politics, Dr. Fickle makes a convincing argument for an understanding of gaming as a way of understanding the world, and gameplay as an enactment of racialization. Dr. Fickle is currently working on a digital archive and analysis of the canonical Asian American anthology, IE. And for those of you who don't know, IE is one of the first, if not the first, collection of Asian American literature, and was edited by Sean Wong, who's a faculty member here in UW. The book is highly celebrated, but also very controversial, and the impetus of thousands of late-night dorm room debates. So the fact that Dr. Fickle decided to take this up and write a new introduction is quite brave, and you'll see that same kind of bravery in her intellectual work and her discussion of gaming today. She also runs the You on the Market website, which is a comprehensive website for academic job seekers. And I'll send those out to any of our graduate students who are listening and who might be interested in reading some more about that. So as I said, I'd like to have maybe Dr. Fickle start.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you for that really generous introduction. And thanks so much to everyone for being here. I'm really appreciative of the people who made this possible at UW. LeiLani, of course, whose work, especially on mixed race identity, I first discovered in college and has really shaped and informed my thinking now for a lot of years since then. And then also to Anu Hastings, Megan Jeffrey, and the Department of Communication. Let me just switch the view here so I can see myself. Okay, so in a time of virtual everything, it also felt especially important to acknowledge the material conditions in which my scholarship is produced. So I wanted to state that Eugene, Oregon, which is where I'm speaking to you from, is located on the occupied land of the Colloquium people, who were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. I recognize that every member of the University of Oregon community, including myself, has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding, and that we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. And I would add to think about how our very notion of American nationhood is premised on a logic of erasure and expropriation, which is a project that I hope my own scholarship can make some small contribution to helping to expose and dismantle. Colloquium descendants are now primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they remain flourishing members of the communities and the land that we now refer to as the state of Oregon. So let me switch over to my screen share, and in the spirit of thinking about our relationships to the spaces that produced us, I'd like to start talking about the race card, which is broadly about how games have been used to establish and combat Asian racial stereotypes from the late 19th century onward, by saying a little bit about how I came to write it, both in terms of the ideas for the individual chapters and also how writing this book led me to some reflections about my own identity as a mixed-race Asian American woman and as someone who plays games but did not identify as a gamer. So I'd like to start doing that by showing you kind of the bones of the book, the table of contents. It was really important for me to communicate when I was writing this book and thinking about how to organize it. The real kind of playfulness and game logic that I talk about in the book through the form of it. So that's why the chapters are organized chronologically and then also paired thematically according to the logic of a six-sided die, which, as I'm sure you know, as a rule has opposing sides that add up to 7. So the first pair of chapters, which is 1 and 6, they trace the long history of using game rhetoric, so game metaphors, game images, game logic, to vilify and exclude Chinese immigrants on the basis of their quote-unquote cheap play, first in late 19th century gold mining operations in the US, and then later as 21st century digital laborers called gold farmers in the game world of Warcraft. And then chapters 2 and 5, in turn, put the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 into a new light by thinking about the kinds of gamic effects it produced. So chapter 2 is considering how game theory, which you'll often hear about in economics and some of the sciences as a mathematical model for rational decision-making, how that was also used as a racial theory to rationalize the US government's decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans in camps. While chapter 5 looks across the Pacific to show how Japanese imperialism and atomic history shaped the Pokemon franchise. And then finally, chapters 3 and 4 function as the kind of bridge of the book, and they bring together two fields which rarely speak to one another, game studies and Asian American studies, by showing how they're in fact already in conversation because of the Orientalist underpinnings to theories of play, and as Chris mentioned, concepts like the magic circle that inform modern game studies. And conversely, how the language of chance, fairness, and meritocracy underlies the neoliberal myth of the Asian North American model minority. So now that you kind of have a sense of what the book looks like, I'll just say a little bit about where it came from. So the literal inspiration for the book was Amy Tan's best-selling novel, The Joylet Club, which it might surprise some to hear because first, it's not a book. First, it's a book, not a game. And secondly, because it's pretty widely agreed in Asian American studies that The Joylet Club is a wholly contentless, overly palatable, highly politically suspect novel. Ouch. But it's all about games. In fact, the book itself is structurally organized as a game of Mahjong between the four mothers and the four daughters. And the way that it discussed Asian immigration to the United States as this high risk, high reward game of chance and strategy was kind of an original light bulb moment for me. It really got me thinking, wait a minute, even though the book seems on the surface to completely satisfy and has been absolutely excoriated for pandering to white American fantasies about this kind of mythical Asian foreigner being transmuted through hard work and frugality into the model minority, it's really about the opposite. It's using games like Mahjong, games like chess, to show that you actually need to play, to gamble and bluff and break the rules. That is actually what it means to play the game that we're calling the American dream and to navigate this tangled web of the American immigration system. And from there, I really started to realize that this phenomenon wasn't unique to Amy Tan, that I'd actually seen this idea of games before in The Woman Warrior, in No No Boy, and Fifth Chinese Daughter, in all of these classics of Asian American literature that aren't ever talked about really in terms of their games. And it's something that I had seen in my own life too, where not only were there regularly Mahjong games that stretched into the late hours, but my mother's side in general, who immigrated from Hong Kong and Shanghai, loved to gamble at all sorts of games. And I realized one of the things that's kind of nice about this virtual format is I could show you this thing that I would never bring to an actual talk. And it's one of my most beloved Christmas presents. It was this completely functional mini slot machine that my grandmother, my Chinese grandmother, bought me when I was 6. And what I kind of love about it, hold on, grab this, I think you can see it here, is that it's, kind of a scale model for the whole sort of zero-sum contradictory cultural narrative around gambling that I talk about a lot in this book. They market it to parents by showing that in addition to it being a slot machine, it's also a bank. So you can put the money either in the front to gamble it, or you could save it, right? This whole idea about you're going to save or you're going to risk this hard-earned money. And, my mother, my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, all of whom immigrated, worked really extremely hard at the same time. And when I was little, I really never thought about that seeming contradiction of working and playing hard and how that might be central to what it meant to them to be not just immigrants, but Asian American immigrants. Because it also took me a very long time to understand and to accept that America is not the meritocracy that it may have appeared to be on the outside, and that it was luck as much as hard work that could explain my own family's kind of model minority status and my own success too. So in general, thinking about some of the reasons behind the particular artifacts I look at in the book is this driving sense that trying to pay attention to rather than disavow these gambling and games of chance in Asian North American history, not only does that create a more honest picture of Asian Americans and the way that we play, but it's also a way to challenge some of these stereotypes, a number of them associated with this kind of thematized Asiaticness that Chris is talking about, and stereotypes, cybertypes really, of Asians as robotic, unplayful, uncreative, risk-averse, work-obsessed, and to think about how those stereotypes really feed into these larger nationalist myths about America as a colorblind or post-racial land of opportunity. And these stereotypes, as I show in the book, have shaped not just attitudes about individuals or experiences of individuals, but really major milestones in Asian American history, including legal decisions like immigration exclusion and incarceration during World War II that on the surface, seemingly have nothing to do with games proper. So that's why that first half of the book, those first few chapters, is about games from a kind of analog conceptual perspective. I'm interested in thinking about how the language and the logic of games as these kind of little self-contained neoliberal stories about the level playing field, how those are used to justify the racial hierarchies and inequalities that define the history of this country. And not just past history. I've become more and more aware after I finished this book, and since it's gone to press, how much this really extends to the tenor of contemporary geopolitics too. So for example, US-China relations, right, which are increasingly reliant on characterizations of China as a rule breaker, a cheater, right, against whom fair competition is impossible. And it's these ludic image economies, as I'll talk about, which undergird these. So the larger argument here is that in order to fully appreciate how race works in video games, we really need to understand better how long before consoles and computers, race was already at play in all of these other different ways, in tabletop games, sporting contests, and more abstractly through discourse and representation, and how those combine into a larger ecosystem. So the second half of the book, which is about video games, builds from that more expansive conception of gaming, while also being inspired by a very different set of personal experiences. So I grew up in Southern California in the 1980s at a time when Nintendo was first entering the North American scene. This is another, I think, really important and interesting point of convergence between the work of Chris and I, and the way that he thinks too about how the Asiatic functions as a producer of video games, both in material and abstract terms. So I hope we get a chance to talk about that more. For me, I was introduced to the Nintendo, not by friends, but actually by my dad, who was, kind of a bit of a computer geek and arguably got it as much for himself as for me and my cousin, which I think speaks to the status of gaming technology in the 80s alongside things like the personal computer. So, Mario and Marble Madness and later like Zork and King's Quest and Doom, video games and computer games are really a central feature of my childhood. But, around I'd say like 6th grade or so, although nobody said anything explicitly, it sort of just started to feel like games weren't really for me anymore. That, the girls in my class were doing other things and the games themselves just didn't really speak to me the same way anymore. So the games that I'm talking about in the second half of the book, specifically World of Warcraft and Pokemon, were really those games that kind of brought me back to gaming as a young adult, that allowed me to see myself as a gamer, even though I didn't call myself that. So the interplay really between these two parts of the book and between the two sides of my own family really reflect, I think, the race card's journey as well as its central concern, which is how games shape and are shaped by, to use Chris's term, the Asiatic experience. And so in the remainder, in the last few minutes today, I just want to get a little bit more technical in talking about how games do that through this dynamic that I call Ludo-Orientalism. So Ludo or ludic is coming from the Latin word ludus, which is used variously to mean sports, games, play, different kinds of training. And it's this broadness that I find really useful. So I use it in the book as a way to build on Edward Said's paradigmatic concept of Orientalism in terms of the images and narratives and epistemes. In other words, the various ways through which a society is making sense of itself and things at the moment, and specifically how this idea of the West, to go back to what Chris was saying of Asia as construct, how the West has made sense of this thing called the East, partly by defining itself as this coherent entity called the West against this equally static monolith called the East. So Ludo-Orientalism is describing first how games can function as nation-building discourses, which define East and West in relation to these abstract game ideals of fairness and freedom, usually positioning the East on one side against fairness and freedom, and the West aligned with it. And I also use this term to show how those global dynamics of East and West are really inextricable from their racialization. In other words, how the East gets positioned not only as a spatial and cultural non-Western entity, but also as a non-white other. So secondly, Ludo-Orientalism is describing how games can function as racializing discourses that make Asian difference meaningful by characterizing it in game terms, and that Asian and Asian American artists, activists, and game designers also play with and at times subvert. So by artists, I mean both fiction writers, like the creators of Asian American literature I was speaking about earlier, but also visual artists. So let me show you an image here, for example. As a comment on the war in Syria, the Aleppo-born photographer Coletta Keel produced this series using images from the game Pokemon Go. And what this work really beautifully highlights is how the mechanics and the dynamics of Pokemon Go, in other words, its rules and the kinds of behaviors that it rewards, are like so many other games all about collection and conquest. In other words, not only does this art bring home how much a game like Pokemon Go resembles older world domination games that you may be familiar with, for example, like Risk, but it also renders visible the continuity with contemporary wars. In fact, US military personnel played Pokemon Go incessantly, so much so that they had to be banned from playing it on base because of security concerns, with the first of those bans coming, where else? From Pearl Harbor military base, interestingly. So I also chose this image, though, of Akil's because I think it captures part of what makes games like Pokemon Go so compelling. And that's the dissonance that's created by superimposing these really cute, brightly colored, harmless little game creatures against this underbelly that we would often prefer not to look at, the suffering and devastation that is the product of extremist and imperious violence that goes hand in hand with global capitalism. But that, I think, is what games really create and maintain, the illusion of that dissonance, the perception that these two things, right, the pocket monster and the militant, the game world and the real world, are distinct, are antithetical, rather than what they are, which is mutually constitutive. Because so the myth really that this book wants to topple above all is that games are these innocent, apolitical, simplistic escapes that they're often treated as. So the book is really about how games have actively shaped and supported the way that Americans think about race, progress, inequality for over a century. And once we recognize that, I think we can really enrich the ways that we've historically taken on racism and sexism in games at the level of visual representation. And this, I think, is where Chris and I's work is especially synergistic, because I think we're both in agreement about how important it is to critique, but also go beyond some of the stereotypes and caricatures that appear on screen at the level of visual representation in games, or say like the number of skin shades that are available for avatar customization. So these kinds of representations, as I said, are absolutely in need of critique, and where I see my work coming in is to help expand that critique by showing how, as overt signs, they're also epiphenomenal, right? They can also be thought of as symptoms on screen, mediated on screen symptoms of some entrenched social fictions that are encoded within. So by extending our purview of games and play below the surface and focusing on that racialization and especially that sexualization in terms of that underlying ludic logic, I think we start to see how games are also self-making and other-making technologies. And so that's why, in reference to the title and subtitle of this book, it's by defining games as racial technologies, in other words, mechanisms that transform a social fiction into a social reality, that this book helps explain how arbitrary forms of human difference are made to feel not only real, but justified in the contemporary epoch. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Right. Oh, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, so much to think about. So I have some prepared questions, but they've kind of also been refigured from listening to you all talk. So sorry if these aren't perfectly beautiful questions. Hopefully they'll be good to start out a conversation. So I was thinking too that, when I first invited you here, it was before COVID, and you've written before then as well. But I'm hearing in your conversations and when I was reading these kind of ideas that might have been transformed or rethought through COVID. So I'd like to have you all talk a bit about where you see kind of this moment and where you see your work maybe giving us ways to understand it better or think through it. So one of the things I was thinking about, Tara, for instance, or Dr. Fickle, was about how you talk about gaming as being this way that we can toggle back and forth, that we have toggled back and forth between model minority and yellow peril. And I'm wondering, it seems like we're at a moment right now where we're at this kind of shifting point, right? Where we're much more leaning towards yellow peril, and sort of thinking, are there ways that you understand games or the way that we play games, particularly online games, as facilitating that shift that's going on right now? And the other thing I was thinking about, Chris, was actually in both of your books, you spend part of your time talking about mapping and gaming and thinking about the ways that maps help orient us in the game and also help us rethink how we think about space, and particularly about national boundaries. And so I'm wondering, in this time period where it seems like we're backing away from thinking about globalization, or backing away from sort of the celebration of globalization, and really reconstituting national boundaries, being stuck in place, what you think sort of the ways that games have enabled us to rethink boundaries, or enabled us to think about geography differently, how that might affect, I guess, how it is that we're thinking about space now, right, with COVID and the redrawing of national boundaries. So for both of those questions, those are the kinds of things that your writing has gotten me started thinking about. But I really want to make it wide open for whatever it is that you might want to talk about in terms of COVID and the contemporary situation and games.
Sure, I can go first, unless you wanted to, Tara.
That's good.
Because I think I have kind of a similar answer for both questions, which is that as I tried to show in my talk, I think one of the things I'm getting out of games is their kind of lack of seriousness, I guess, and trying to see what if we just took them kind of not seriously, but what if we played with them as playful objects and took a kind of playful way of using theory and frameworks to think about them as well. And just said, they're pointless, frivolous, and silly and stupid, and let's just, deal with that. And I think that actually makes them more interesting than trying to say that they're educational or something like that. And so that framework, I think, goes to both of those questions in a way. I'm still trying to figure out, as everyone else is, what's happening with COVID and everything. But I think there's a reason why we can see so many anti-Asian racist stereotypes in video games. And yet we don't see a lot of the same kind of effects as we see with the anti-Asian racism that's coming out of COVID. And so I think, there's a lot of different ways to track that, of course. But I think because COVID is part of this medical scientific discourse, as Nayan Shah writes about, pandemics in Chinatowns, it gets taken very seriously and becomes a life or death issue to people who are just standing next to someone they perceive as Asian in a supermarket. And then it ends up producing, these very visible forms of anti-Asian racism. Whereas I feel like in games, even though you have much harsher and worse representations in a lot of ways, gamers just don't take it seriously. It doesn't have nearly the same kind of impact, and the same kind of urgency attached to it at all. Which is to say that, not to say one's better than the other or anything like that, but that they're just different. And I just got kind of disillusioned with a lot of game studies work on race that seem to be seeing those things as the same. And we're unable to account for how games were within this genre where race is being read very differently. And so to me, COVID is actually an interesting example where I don't feel like games are working to replicate a lot of the racism. I think they're actually working against it in a lot of ways, because of this kind of lack of seriousness. There's always very cinematic games that are about how evil North Korea is and stuff like that. I think just clearly made by American companies, but a lot of games are made by Japanese companies and have these blending and fusions and things that I think put what we think of as Asian and Asianness under stress and under problematization, right? So I think that they offer a different way of seeing race and Asianness that's very different. I think that similarly goes with mapping and borders. My last chapter of the book is on mapping and borders in games, and how you have this scientific militaristic discourse about borders. And I get a lot of this from Karen Kaplan's latest book on the aerial view, which is really fascinating, where she talks a lot about how the militarization of the kind of God's eye view, the aerial view, has made us presume that every time we see a map or anything, it's completely scientific and natural and so on, when in fact that wasn't the way that people always saw maps. People often saw maps as very tangential, messy things. And I think a lot of games that I talk about in the last chapter at least, try to kind of reinstate maps as something that's supposed to make you feel lost. Not something that's supposed to point you to where you're supposed to go, but actually things that are supposed to mess with you and disorient you. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually like where you ended that in terms of thinking about maps and orientation and disorientation, because that's definitely a way that I've thought about maps in the book. And, like I've really struggled with this thinking about games in COVID and the current moment from a direction that is both kind of politically responsible but isn't overdetermined, right? Like this book isn't about COVID, and it doesn't have an answer. And as an academic book, it feels even more sort of insular maybe at times. But I guess I'll say two things about it. One is that I've been really interested and impressed by some like indie game responses to COVID. In fact, Chris, I think, has been really responsible for turning me onto a lot of these indie games that are really taking up these questions. Like Mike Wren had a game recently that was really brilliantly using this kind of God's eye view perspective to show how governmentality and governmental responses to COVID are very much a gamified model, right, of sort of quantifying and identifying and isolating and predicting infection, quarantine, infected bodies. And so in that game, you actually are taking on the role of the government, although it's not quite so explicit as that, and trying to click as fast as you can to kind of like quarantine and isolate certain ones. And that's actually a co-written piece that Chris and I and a number of other scholars have done for Verge. And the other part of it, though, that's been interesting to me is how one of the responses to COVID was that there was going to be a really big boom in video games, and especially in esports or competitive video game playing. And it was understood to be one of the only forms of athletic contests that were going to be viable anymore, because people were allowed to play from home and separately, so that we could watch it. And one of the games, and I think Chris talked about this a little bit, it's one of the most popular esports titles is League of Legends. And so, like many other people, and I think you've been hearing lately, especially, there's been all these pieces about Ilhan Omar and AOC and their gaming setups and how they've been playing League of Legends and Among Us. That this is a game that a lot of people got into or started playing a lot more because of COVID, and I would say I would count myself in that. I started playing in order to learn more about esports, which is part of a second set of projects that I've been working on. But I also realized in playing it that the kind of indoor social life that games often kind of put us in can self-replicate in kind of unpleasant ways. The thing about a game like League of Legends, right? I mean, to go back to what I'm saying at the end of the talk I just gave about visual representation and the limits of the critique of visual representation, I guess I'd say I actually feel a little bit hypocritical about looking back, because I realized that, yes, there are limits to that, but when you play a game like that, you're just barraged by racist, sexist visual representations of all of the characters. I mean, that is in some way what they are. They're all types. And so thinking through, I think, trying to use the work to think through these games, but also using my experiences during COVID to rethink some of the really hard and fast claims I made in the book has been useful, because I think coming at it from an academic perspective, it has been easy to critique earlier iterations of scholarship or of the mainstream popularity of these games, you know, and I was critical of people who loved them anyway, despite their serious problems. And I have a more kind of nuanced understanding of that now.
Yeah, you know, I'd love to hear more about the piece that you're doing for Verge. I mean, it has struck me. I think about like these charts like put out by the Washington Post, where you can adjust different you know, parameters, different places that you're looking at, and it will make the graphs look differently. And there's some way that it seems very kind of game-like in trying to predict or compare different kinds of data to each other. So yeah, could you talk about that a little more?
Yeah, I'll just say a little bit about it, and then Chris, maybe you can also fill in on some of the others, because this is sort of one joint piece out of a handful of them for the special issue of Verge. And I think in that piece, we talk a little bit more about how, as you say, not just quantification, but the simulation is so central to COVID. And the relationship between games and simulation, of course, that's always been crucial. But for me, I was also particularly struck by how simulations such as those done, let's say there was, I think, a New York Times simulation that came out early on that was attempting to illustrate what it would look like when vapor droplets would be into the air, right? And how that would compare whether wearing a mask or not. And it really looked like nothing if not a kind of gamified simulation where, you know, the goal would be to either, you know, minimize or maximize the amount of spray from there. So yeah, exactly, as you say, it's the interactivity of games that I think is also often emphasized as a thing that differentiates them from other media, especially something like film that you were supposedly passively consuming. I know that's a gross oversimplification, but one thing that I think this whole pandemic has also really revealed is how that interactivity can be found in so many things that are not really defined as games.
I'll expand upon that a bit. I just had to take a moment to like look up that project. So like, what did we talk about? It was like 6 months ago now, and we were able to. I mean, we started, I think, in January or before that, and it was a collaboration with another scholar and 3 designers, and so it was part of our, you know, ambition of like, what would it be like to bring on Asian American identified designers, and it turned out to, I think, to work quite well, and to have roundtables with them. And so one of our roundtables, because COVID happened right in the middle of it, became about COVID-19 and games. And there were games that were released right away when COVID started to happen. So I linked everyone in the chat to one of them, Novel Containment, the one that Tara was talking about. There was another one that came a bit later called A New Life by Angela Hudd, which is kind of a visual novel kind of game. And I think they're very interesting to situate next to each other, because the visual novel one is a bit more of a kind of reparative type of game. It's about how to like fall in love. You know, it's about 2 young Asiatic, I would say, because they're never really discussed what racial background they are. 2 young women who seem to fall in love depending on your choices, and then this pandemic comes and kind of disrupts what's going on. But it's told in a very, you know, kind of choose your own adventure style, but it feels like it's trying to capture the feeling of, you know, loss and fear and dread that's happening during COVID, that I think games can do very, very well without, you know, and making it also about, you know, being Asian American without ever instating a kind of identity or pulling it into those into that framework. And so I think we just kind of you know, tried to. There just became a point where I think a lot of folks have gone through the same thing, where we had planned something, we were working on it, and then we realized, just with everything happening around us, we couldn't possibly continue unless we made it about the thing happening all around us. And so we just got lucky that these Asian American identified indie gamers started coming out with these pretty brilliant games, trying to kind of capture. And one of the game Novel Containment, by the way, is from Mike. Mike lives in Shanghai, so he had a very different point of view of what was happening and the kind of state surveillance regimes that were going on. It was kind of built as a kind of, not really a warning, but, you know, a way to develop a strategy to understand how these networks were going to be working with us and against us. But I think, if more people had played that game, they might have been a bit more aware of how the surveillance state was going to kind of manage the crisis.
Yeah. I want to make sure that we have time to take questions from the audience. I don't know if you say from the group here. So I do have a couple questions, but I can leave them to the end, saying like if we have time for it. So if people are interested in asking questions, like I said, you could drop them in the chat here, or if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can ask your question that way. So. Maybe a couple minutes. And maybe while we're waiting for folks to ask questions, maybe I can ask one more then. So one of the other questions I had was more kind of oriented towards the grad students who are here, or the undergrads who are here, is that we generally don't get a whole lot of training in how to read games or how to analyze games. I know that both of you are coming out of an English literature background, so my assumption is that was not the training that you had in graduate school either. So I'm interested in how it is that you sort of figured out how to do this. So what are your touchstones, and what are some of the principles maybe that you use when you're approaching games that would differentiate it from how you might approach something that's more static, right? A more kind of text-based analysis.
I can go first, I guess. I'm just used to talking out of putting my foot in my mouth. But I don't know if I ever did, and I don't know if that was really a bad thing, because Ed Chang also did the work of introducing me and a lot of other folks to game studies at University of Washington. So huge shout out to Ed. I probably wouldn't be as interested in it. I think the first game studies books I ever read were when I was an undergraduate at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And so I knew I was into game studies, and from the beginning of my academic, interest, I guess. But I also did not like game studies as a discourse. And I just stopped reading it for a while because I just thought, this is not at all the way that I play games and communicate with games. Nothing I was reading was really about games the way that I play them and the way it's been there in my life, except for maybe some work by like Lisa Nakamura and so on. But it was very rare, and so I just felt like the whole field was just kind of reductive and just not very interesting. And then I returned to it like 2 or 3 years later, realizing in 2011 or so, Adrian Shaw had published a pretty groundbreaking article in a journal about how we just saw, it was basically called to arms for critical cultural studies version of game studies. And then folks started coming out with really amazing work pretty quickly after that. And so I think it was partly not being trained in the game studies work that I just found pretty just not that interesting. And then reading and just keeping along with the newer work. And so in my book, I go quite into a lot of detail, perhaps too much, into the methods of literary theories and queer theory methods, especially by Roland Barr is one of the big people I use a lot in the book. Eve Sedgwick, I use quite a lot. And so I'm still not apologetic at all about using these theorists to think about games, because they're also thinking about text as very interactive objects. And so I think one thing we can do is just, game studies is, I think one of its strengths is that it permeates through so many fields and so many disciplines. And if we just kind of say, okay, I'm from communications or I'm from this discipline, I'm going to talk about games, I had this theoretical basis, and that makes my work a bit different and more interesting, and it's not going to be the same as someone else who comes from this other discipline, and just being able to kind of account for that and I see it more as a strength to come from literary studies and be able to have that background when I think about games. But I also am not going to pretend that I know how to, that I don't have that background, I guess. Yeah, and so I think in my book, I also had to do a lot of work. A lot of the revisions was me just reading more new, more recent work coming from game studies, because I still had that, allergy to early game studies work.
Yeah, it's funny, I spent a year at UW. It was actually where I started college, and I had a number of friends that I knew by way of ethnic studies classes, who were in the Department of Communication. And I remember thinking, that's so cool. Like, I don't know what that kind of department is. What does that mean? Like, do you study telecommunications, like actual communication networks? And I said, yeah, sort of, but it also became clear that it was very broadly about discourse, about cultural studies. And although I didn't find out many years later, it's also, I think, one of the richest sites for game studies. There's kind of, it seems to me, often a divide that I didn't really understand myself, especially in undergraduate, but then later in graduate school, between game studies as it's done in English departments and game studies as it's done in journalism communication departments. And I've found myself of late, I think, much more drawn to that latter method, even though I'm still very much a product of a kind of formalist take. And, in game studies, in graduate school, for me, I became most interested in trying to define games, right? Going back to this positivist thing that Chris is talking about, right? What is the game? What makes it distinct? What are its exact features? And for me, that kind of became a bit of a dead end. It was interesting, but when one, I think, is so attracted to that idea of having, let's say, a dissertation that is going to define games once and for all and sort of put the boundaries and end the conversation on it, it was actually really limiting. And some of the ways that we do scholarship there, instead of understanding it as sort of pieces contributing to a larger conversation and a work that's being produced over time, that literary studies model was a little bit limiting. But I will also say, in terms of the original question about kind of how we came to do it, there weren't really any such things as game studies jobs, at least in the US, at the time that I was coming onto the market. And so kind of cobbling it together for myself from a background outside of literary studies in critical theory especially, but also media theory, media studies. And then there's a number of ways when we think about how to train yourself to read games. There was a really interesting textbook that I believe it was Brenda Brathwaite wrote it, although, sorry, I'll have to find the actual title of it, that broke down games into a potentially reductive, but I thought really useful, ultimately, framework to think about games in relationship between their mechanics, their dynamics, and their aesthetics, is what she talked about, right? And we can broadly think about mechanics as the rules of a game, and dynamics as the behavioral and social dynamics that come out of the mechanics. So I think one of the examples she gave, and this is why I also think of it more broadly, analog and digital, is she said, in a game like poker, the rule is, the mechanics are that you are trying to set up a hand this way, and that you can't look at each other's hands, that kind of thing. But bluffing is a dynamic, right? The result of trying to achieve the goal that you want, the objective you want within the rules and constraints that you have, it creates a secondary set of dynamics. And the aesthetics is a somewhat more amorphous term that refers both to sort of the look of the game as well as the kind of experience of playing it. But for me, I think that was a moment at which I thought, okay, this is a really interesting way to try to provide what you could essentially think of as close readings or close playings of games that can be both close and distant in a way that is different from literary studies, but still really interesting to me as a mode of inquiry.
Thank you. So we have a question in the chat. I'm just going to read it out from Joshua. You mentioned that many representations of Asiatic individuals in games tend not to be explicitly discussed, but one of the more recent examples I found is the blurring of social media, games, and music in the character produced by Riot Games in relation to League of Legends Seraphine. If you're familiar with the social media campaign, how do you think this interfaces with your current understandings?
I can start on this one, Chris, if you want.
Okay, yeah.
This is, I kind of love this question because I actually just encountered Seraphine myself. So this is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, maybe I should just give a really quick overview, which is it's consistently featured not only within the Riot Games client, right, when you open it up, but it is this kind of multimodal thing where there's a virtual K-pop band that has been composed of League of Legends characters. And so Seraphine is the newest character to be added, which is to say that she's not real, right? She's virtual. But she also has a Twitter, and it's very highly followed, and it's very constantly updated. And in it, it kind of traces her journey to becoming the newest member of this K-pop band. Chris, would you say that's an accurate representation of it?
Sure.
And it's fascinating though, because, you know, she talks in that way through Twitter and everything, but, you know, she creates like diaries and drawings and all these kinds of things. But where I think it really intersects with the framework that Chris is talking about is, what is her racial status, right? She has pink hair. To be clear, the other characters, for example, Ari is arguably a fox, right? Like, she's a girl, but also a fox character. But that, you know, I remember looking rather deeply into the Seraphine lore, and it seems like her father is Chinese, right? A Chinese immigrant, actually. And so some of the drawings she has are of her father in a cartoon saying, you know, in Chinese, yeah, that's pretty good. That's good enough. So I think it's really interesting thinking about how that kind of multimodal blurring, or that transmedia blurring, has been a way to kind of continue to replay some of those cyber tapes in new ways, and have them kind of come to new life as a way of making the champion itself have new life.
Yeah, and I'm more familiar with the way that I think a lot of companies that have this kind of dizzying diversity, that are also very global companies, a lot of what they offer in their games is a kind of intimate relationship with the characters, even though these characters are quite obviously not very complex, or they're quite surface level, like cyber types, I suppose. And so everyone can kind of recognize that so I think with Seraphine, like, I haven't really followed the Twitter all that well, but I know that it just recycles a lot of like very obvious like Asian like sayings, and it recycles even a lot of, because I think she also has mental health, issues, and she's like neurodiverse. And so she will also write things like, it can get better, it can always get better. So she also recycles the kind of self-help talk that we see all the time. And so they're trying to create this and I think this is what Overwatch and other game companies do very well, where folks will have feel like they have this very intimate understanding of something that is quite obviously fake at the same time. And I'm just very intrigued by that. Like, I haven't been following it, but I think it does come as an evolution in a sense of where a lot of these big companies have been going. Because like with Overwatch, I had this piece in the first chapter of Open World Empire where I got married the same year that Overwatch came out, and it started to become quite a problem in the marriage, because I started to really feel like the main people I was playing in Overwatch, you feel this really strange intimate connection with them, even though they're so obviously not real in any way. It's kind of like a Hello Kitty kind of effect. And so I think games are just becoming more and more conscious of how to do this. And they're usually through Asiatic characters. And so I find that really fascinating, but also quite troubling, and I'm not sure where to go with it yet. But maybe that's something Joshua and others can write more about.
Well, actually, so what you're saying, Chris, actually leads pretty well into this first question that's over here. So let me read that to you. This is from Benjamin Williams. Thank you for sharing your work. I'd love to hear more about the comments made on representation in gaming and its relation to queer theory. Did I understand you correctly that you don't think that people who play video games are interested in increased authentic representations of Asian people, similar to how queer people hunger for greater media representation?
Yeah, that's not my argument. That's Adrian Shaw in Gaming at the Edge. And Adrian Shaw, I still find a very fantastic writer and thinker when it comes to identity and queer politics and race in games. So again, one of the reasons I came back to game studies was because I started reading more Adrian Shaw. But she works mostly off of interviews. And so that they find through interviews that a lot of the gamers that they're looking at, marginalized gamers, are very apprehensive when they see or when they hear about games that are supposed to represent them. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. partially because the game, games, we're just used to seeing horrible representations, like another Talzim is going to come out. Like, why should we care or celebrate that? I think Kishona was talking about that a bit last week with the war game, right? And Black soldiers. And so I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is that a lot of the games that we find to be most reparative, this is something she kind of talks a bit about, but doesn't quite get that much into. The games that we really rely on to kind of communicate with and to feel like ourselves with often don't have any bodily representations at all, or that they just don't represent, they don't try to represent us in certain way. And even what Tara and I have been finding in conversations with Asian American identified designers is they often don't feel like that's part of what they want to do either. They don't feel like their main purpose is to just create better representations of Asian Americans and so on. And I find that that's very widespread in the design communities. And I think most people excuse it as like, oh, they just don't want to talk about race because it's so white and blah, blah, blah. But I think it's actually much more interesting than that they just find games as doing something very capable of different things. And so the ones we collaborate with are the folks from Analgesic Productions who do the Anodyne series, and Melos Hantani and Marika. And so they're both of Asian American identities, but they also don't feel like that's what they want to do with their games. But they're also very political at the same time.
I thought it was interesting in your last comment about how maybe there's something about the obvious fakeness of the Twitter account that kind of allows you to have a relationship with that character that may not be if they were trying to convince you of their authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, there's also one from Kirsten Foote, who's a professor in our department. Thinking back to Dr. Fickle's comment on the Mahjong theme structure of the Joy Luck Club, I'm curious whether, and if so, how, pre-digital games with Asian cultural histories are appropriated in contemporary digital games. And if so, are there differing interpretations of Asiatic tropes in light of those appropriations?
It's really interesting. And maybe Chris actually has some ideas here. I was trying to think through certain examples of what some of these pre-digital games might be. And I was actually thinking about how, if you recall this in the, I don't know, mid-90s or so, how there was actually a huge attraction to computer game versions of Mahjong. Do you remember that? It was nothing like Mahjong itself, right, which is a 4-person game, but instead it was a game in which the Mahjong tiles were stacked upright and you had to be able to match tiles, right, without being able to pick from certain places. And it's interesting because on more than one talk that I've given in the past, I remember that being the first place that people's minds kind of went to connect the digital version of it. And it's interesting because although that's the first thing that came to mind, it's not a pre-digital Asian game, but another one that I think of most. And it's a Dynasty Warriors series, which I don't know if anyone here is familiar with. I would assume so, but it's essentially the Warring Kingdoms period in Chinese history, but rendered into a video game. And there, one of the ways that this kind of Asiatic trope is re-narrated has been very interesting to me, because these are characters, and I say characters because it's very much a kind of legendary lore-based version rather than some sort of like historical accuracy, that are also characters that have been really central to re-envisionings of Asian American identity. So to go back to the second project Ai that I'm working on, the character of Guan Yu, or the God of War, is really central to thinking about how to reconceptualize Asian American identity, either from a more martial, a masculine, a different trans-Pacific heritage, from which we might be able to recuperate our own history. And this is obviously really strongly gendered. And that game, I think, is also glorifying that kind of warlike character, but in a very different way, because it's filtered through a Japanese production company of a Chinese history. So those are the kinds of ones that immediately came to mind, to be thinking about how the kind of pre-digital and the Asiatic is really informing contemporary versions. But Chris, I'd be curious if you can think of an example.
Well, my introduction, I talk about pachinko because Roland Barthes talks about pachinko, and Barthes, for who knows how accurate this is at all, talks about how pachinko is very erotic as opposed to sexual, and he kind of sees like pinball as an American. It seems like he doesn't like pinball. So he says pinball is like just sexual. You see images of women, scantily clad women on pinball machines, but pachinko is an actual erotic form, even though there's nothing like sexual on the surface. And I was really interested in that because then Foucault later picks that up to think about, ars erotica and how Asian cultures are more erotic in certain ways, whereas Western cultures are more like scientific, or they become erotic by looking at science and by defining and categorizing, as opposed to Asian cultures, which do so through mysticism or whatever. I'm reducing it, obviously, to be a bit funny, but so pachinko kind of has it carries it through that purpose. The same, we see kind of reiterations of how people see Japanese games as more perverse, as more erotic, even when they don't have any particular sexual images in them, though they often do. And Japanese games are often censored, or they're localized to be less sexual when they come to North America as well. And so there's that perception has remained, and I think pachinko is an interesting place to start for that. There's also I think we also can use this to think about how we tend to see forms in games as Asiatic, even when they're not really. And so we were in the talk that Tara and I were in before this, we were talking about pay to play methods or loot boxes. So how so many games have loot boxes these days, but if you follow the discourse of where loot boxes come from, people used to think that they came from Korean games like MapleStory, then it was Chinese games. And now there seems like there's this consensus that they came from Japanese, gacha games is what they're called, the capsule toy things. So that loot boxes come from capsule toys, the capsule toys machines that Japanese arcades used to have. And there seems like some weird consensus with that, when I don't think that there's any evidence really that that's the case, like any direct case that that's where it comes from. But I think it just makes people feel like, of course, this is some weird form. And I think evidence shows actually that it was developed in the US. And so I think that there's this tendency to place Asianness onto, or Asiaticness or whatever, onto game forms, even just because it makes us feel like there's something apart from us, or that it keeps it playful and bizarre and silly and fun, something that isn't too involved with our own serious world.
It's interesting that you'd say that, though, because it seems like part of what both of you are arguing is the way that games kind of appear to be universal, or appear to be free of kind of national ties. It's for everybody. Anyone can play games. It's a universal language in some ways. So how are you seeing those kinds of two things in operation? Are they happening simultaneously? Do you think one's covering for the other? What do you see as that relationship?
That's an interesting question about, I think if we take up the example that Chris was just using about loot boxes, which are basically in-game content that you can purchase in many cases without knowing what you're going to get. And so a lot of, because in my work on gold farming, in the other, harvesting virtual goods to be sold for real money is obviously related to this idea of a kind of downloadable or in-game purchasable content. And a lot of the examples that they were using that I saw, Chris, were the Kinder Egg. And so one of the arguments that especially game companies were making, or defenders of it, to legislative bodies who were going to legislate against this as a form of youth gambling, was to say it's actually fun, right? Don't we all enjoy getting a Kinder Egg? I've never actually eaten a Kinder Egg, but my understanding is that inside this chocolate egg, there's some kind of capsule with a toy inside, and the pleasure is not knowing what the toy is going to be. And so I think that it is interesting thinking about how tracing that history alternately to who makes Kinder Eggs? Sweden? Just embarrassing myself here in front of everyone. A Western European created toy, right? Versus, as Chris was saying, this kind of gotcha or Paka Paka line of capsule toys, you know, and thinking about how the way that you choose to historicize it is often a way of kind of displacing the anxiety, I think, that is also a form of racial displacement.
Yeah, I think it also produces, or it allows, I try to talk about it a bit as a stage that, you know, players can then kind of make their own. And I was disappointed because right when I set it in copy edits for the book and it was all finalized, that episode of Black Mirror came out that was just perfect for the book. What's it called? Striking Vipers, where it's about two best friends who are both Black men. One has a family, one's like this playboy, and they end up playing a virtual reality game where they're both Asian characters in the game, but it's so real. And then they have sex with each other in the game, you know, for a lot. and it ends up being very kinky. One of them has sex with a panda. And things like, so it just opens up this really erotic world, but the world around them is very Asiatic, and the characters they're playing are very Asiatic. And so I think that there's like that episode would have been totally perfect for the book, because that's exactly what I'm trying to kind of express, that how games operate and how people play with games. And so I think games are a commodity. It comes with that whole commodity fetishism of obscuring the relations of labor and the material resources. And so I think that's what the first half of my book is mostly about. The second half of the book is mostly about like what designers then do with that. How do they reuse games to make us conscious of the labor and materials that go into it? How do they reuse games to make it more queer, to politicize games in certain ways? And so the other kind of missing chapter of the book is a chapter on visual novels, which are seen as they come from a kind of manga tradition in Japan, but it's in the United States, they're very much associated with a very politicized group of designers and so if you're a fan of visual novels in North America, you're probably a fan of queer politics and anti-racist politics, because those are the most like visibly political, like leftist kind of games. At the same time, they have to wrestle with the fact that they are trying to transform a genre that's also very conservative in other countries, especially in South Korea, which often means if the designers are white, they end up reproducing or replicating a lot of Orientalist stereotypes, because they're trying to distance what they're doing from the conservative forms of visual novels from other countries. And it also means that they think that they seem to buy into that, you know, games that have same-sex relationships from Japan are leftist in some way, or are feminist, when that's not always the case, or that they're queer when that's also not always the case in the same way we would think of it. So I think visual novels would have been a really fascinating thing for me to focus on but when I was writing it, there wasn't as much in the indie community as there is today, but it's a really fascinating genre right now.
So we are just about out of time. We've got 1 minute. I'm wondering if either of you have some last shout outs or anything you want to tell people before we sign off.
I didn't think that far ahead. Oh yeah, buy the book. I put my author code. It should work for both our books if you go to the NYU Press website. Yeah.
Yes, I encourage you all to buy the books. They're a good read and great covers. So thank you both for coming here and for talking to us and being willing to, you know, let the conversation go where it will. So it was wonderful. I really enjoyed it, and I guess we'll let you go.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And everyone who's still on the call will have the recording available soon. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, everybody.